Hello and welcome to Poetry, Reading, Responding, Writing for English 110. I'm your narrator and instructor, Megan Blumenthal, and thanks for watching this presentation. So let's start with the basics. What is poetry? William Wordsworth may have done much to shape our contemporary ideas about poetry when he famously described it as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. However, Wordsworth, for once in his life, may have grossly oversimplified the definition of poetry. That's because trying to define poetry is a bit like trying to catch a snowflake. You can do it, but at the very same moment, the snowflake begins to melt and disappear. With poems, as with fiction, you can come up with examples that don't do what the definition insists they must, as well as numerous writers and readers who will disagree. Yet to claim that poetry eludes all definition is merely to reinforce the idea that it is simply too mysterious for ordinary mortals or regular old UNCW students. So let's start with two definitions from two different dictionaries, Merriam-Webster and the Oxford English Dictionary. The first one from Merriam-Webster defines poetry as writing that formulates a concentrated, imaginative awareness of experience in language chosen and arranged to create a specific emotional response through meaning, sound, and rhythm. The second one, from the Oxford English Dictionary, defines poetry as composition in verse or some comparable patterned arrangement of language in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, traditionally associated with the explicit formal departure from the patterns of ordinary speech or prose, for example, in the use of elevated diction, figurative language, and syntactical reordering. For our purposes in English 110, we can look at both of these definitions and come to the conclusion that, different as they are, both of the definitions stress four elements. The patterned arrangement of language, number one. Number two, generate rhythm, and thereby both three, express and evoke specific emotions or feelings in number four, a concentrated way or with intensity. And it's not just these two definitions. Look it up in any dictionary and you'll find these four elements in the definition of poetry. So, four elements: the patterned arrangement of language to generate rhythm and thereby both express and evoke specific emotions or feelings in a concentrated way or with intensity. That's how we'll define poetry. But what makes poetry so different from prose fiction, short stories, novels, things like that? Well, poetry speaks to the head as well as the ear, ears as well as eyes. Essentially, form, things like lines and stanzas, and sound, things like rhyme, meter, and rhythm, render poetry a genre in its own right. Poetry remains, as it has been for thousands of years, a more insistently oral form, one that appears through oral patterning to what Lydia Davis, in her poem Head Heart, humorously calls the ears of heart. As poet Mary Oliver puts it, to make a poem, we must make sounds, not random sounds, but chosen sounds. Poetic subgenres and kinds are basically just the different classifications of poems, right? And poems may be classified into subgenres based on various characteristics, including their length, their appearance, formal features, things like the patterns of rhyme and rhythm, their subject, what they're about, right? Or even the type of situation or setting, the time and the place that they depict. A sonnet, for example, is a poem that has 14 lines, and an elegy is any poem about death. It's important to keep in mind that a single poem might well represent multiple subgenres, or at least might contain elements of more than one. So an elegy, any poem about death, may also be a sonnet, a poem with 14 lines, about death. And back to Aristotle, he's everywhere. Since his time, readers and writers have often divided poems into 3 broad categories or subgenres, and we'll consider these as our 3 big categories in this class: narrative, dramatic, and lyric. And they're divided up based on their mode of presentation. To put it simply, poems that have a plot are either narrative poems, if they feature a narrator, or dramatic poems, if they don't feature a narrator. And many poems that lack a plot are lyric poems. So you can remember one way to tell what type of poem you are reading, narrative, dramatic, or lyric, is by considering whether or not it has a plot, and then if it does have a plot, does it have a narrator? Let's start with narrative poetry. Like a work of fiction or prose fiction, a narrative poem tells a story. In other words, it has a plot related by a narrator, though its plot might be based on actual rather than made-up events. Comprised of the same elements discussed in the fiction section of the Norton, a narrative poem encourages us to ask the same questions about character, plot, narration, and so on, that we do when we read a short story or novel. For more about the questions to ask when reading narrative poetry, you can see the questions about the elements of fiction in the Norton on page 15. The next type of poetry we'll focus on is dramatic poetry. For centuries, plays were written exclusively or mainly in verse. As a result, drama itself was understood not as a genre in its own right, as we think of it today, but rather as a subgenre of poetry. Dramatic poetry thus means, and still can mean, actual plays in verse, or verse drama. But any poem that consists wholly of dialogue among characters, unmediated by a narrator, counts as a dramatic poem. And we may even apply that label to poems in which narration is kept to the barest minimum, as is the case in Thomas Hardy's The Ruined Maid, which you can see on page 852 in the Norton. When we read and write about dramatic poems, we can usefully bring to bear the same questions we do in reading drama. And to find out what those questions are, since we haven't gotten to our drama unit yet, you can see the questions to ask when reading a play in the chapter Drama, Reading, Responding, Writing, pages 1123 through 1124 in the Norton. Last, we come to the lyric poem. Originally, a lyric was a poem meant to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. Now, any relatively short poem in which the speaker expresses his or her thoughts and feelings in the first person rather than recounting a narrative or portraying a dramatic situation. Basically, relatively short poems that focus primarily on the feelings, impressions, and thoughts, that is, on the subjective inward experience of a single first-person speaker, are lyrics. However, lyric poems may also consist largely of descriptive or observational lyrics rather than lyrics about I, to help readers see the world differently. In fact, 19th century poet Percy Bysshe Shelley suggested that all poetry's major purpose is just that, to help us see things in a new way. Poetry, he said, strips the veil of familiarity from the world and lays bare its naked and sleeping beauty and wonder. Now, a newer invention since Aristotle's time is the dramatic monologue. And it's a subgenre of poem that, sort of by residing somewhere in between lyric and dramatic poetry, can teach us more about both. Robert Browning, the 19th century British poet, often credited with inventing this kind of poem, tellingly labeled his own works dramatic lyrics, describing them as dramatic in principle, lyric in expression. A dramatic monologue is lyric in expression, or like a lyric poem, because it features a single speaker who discusses him or herself. On the other hand, it is dramatic in principle, or resembles a scene from a play, for at least two reasons. First, the poem's primary focus is characterization, an obviously fictional or historical speaker's often unintentional revelation of his or her personality, outlook, and values. Such poems tend to offer us a window into an entire complex psychology and even life history, rather than simply one experience or feeling of a speaker we otherwise discover little about, as in lyrics. Often, too, dramatic monologues invite us to see their speakers and situations somewhat differently than the speakers themselves do, much as does fiction narrated by unreliable narrators. The second way it is dramatic in principle, a dramatic monologue is dramatic in principle, is because the speaker of a dramatic monologue often addresses one or more silent auditors whose identity we can only infer from the speaker's words to them. The questions we pose in reading and writing about such poems thus often center on character and characterization, and the gap between our perception of the speaker and his or her situation on the one hand, and the speaker's own self-representation on the other. More formally, and perhaps more clearly, and just to recap what a dramatic monologue is, a dramatic monologue is a type or subgenre of poetry in which a speaker addresses a silent auditor or auditors in a specific situation and setting that is revealed entirely through the speaker's words. This kind of poem's primary aim is the revelation of the speaker's personality, views, and values. An example of a dramatic monologue that we will read in this class is Alfred Tennyson's Ulysses, which consists of an aged Ulysses' words to the mariners whom he hopes to convince to return to sea with him. Most of Robert Browning's poems, if you're looking for more examples of a dramatic monologue, including My Last Duchess, which is in the Norton, are dramatic monologues. Okay, so before we wrap this up, a couple of things to think about when you're reading and responding to poetry. Poems take on additional meanings if we approach them systematically, bringing to bear specific reading habits and skills and some knowledge of poetic genres and conventions. If you're relatively new to poetry, encounter a poem that seems especially difficult, or plan to write about a poem, you may need to tackle steps 1 through 9 outlined in the Norton on pages 860 through 867, one at a time, pausing to write even as you read and respond. With further experience, you'll often find that you can skip the steps or run through them quickly and almost automatically, though your experience and understanding of any poem will be enriched if you slow down, take your time, and try to really respond to these questions in a way that's similar to the way they've modeled it on pages 860 through 867 in the Norton. So the questions, and also steps to follow, because they're not all questions, right? Okay, so the first thing, listen to a poem first. What does this mean? Read through it once without thinking too much about what it means. Just run through it. Don't try to focus on whether or not you're understanding every word or looking things up. Just sort of read through it, listen to it, and in fact, I would recommend to read it out loud, and maybe put a little dramatic effort into it, and just listen to it, hear it, try to feel where it's going, and not think too much about what it means. So that's step one, listen to a poem first. 2, articulate your expectations starting with the title. 3, read the syntax literally. What are the words literally saying to you versus, what may be some implied meanings or connotations, or double entendre wordplay in all forms. To get that kind of stuff, you might need to consult reference works, not only to get wordplay and things like that, but also look up difficult words that you might not know or be familiar with. Number 5, and this is a big one, figure out who, where, when, and what happens. Once you've done that, take step 6, formulate tentative answers to the questions, why does this all matter? What does it mean? What is this saying to me? Number 7, consider how the poem's form contributes to its effect and meaning. 8, investigate and consider the ways the poem both uses and departs from poetic conventions, especially those related to form and subgenre. And number 9, probably the most important, argue, or in a more neutral term, discuss, talk about this stuff. Discussing poems with others, both out loud and in writing, usually results in clarification and keeps you from being too dependent on any sort of personal biases and preoccupations that sometimes mislead even the best readers. So bring your thoughts and ideas about the poems that we read to class with you, because we'll talk about them and you'll learn things from other people's perspectives. Simple, right? A few key things to keep in mind about poetry are also listed in the Norton, and I just want to reiterate them here briefly before we wrap it up, because poetry isn't always so simple, or at least it doesn't seem that way, and it can be quite intimidating to many students. And I hope that you won't get hung up on sort of all the formalities and conventions and things like that so much that you can't enjoy it and appreciate it a little more after leaving this class. So keep in mind that poetry itself isn't all one thing. Poems are as different as people in the world. A good poem is not a secret message. You don't need a special decoder ring or an advanced degree to decipher poems. Any thoughtful person who's willing to try can make sense of them. Though some poems certainly do invite us to rethink our idea of what making sense might mean, it's important to keep in mind that, for the most part, they're not specifically trying to be tricky. It's about expression for most poets. So people around the world have often turned to poetry to express their feelings, on that note, and their longings, precisely because poetry is, in certain vital ways, distinct from other forms of writing. Each genre of poetry plays by its own rules and has its own history and traditions. So reading poetry effectively, like succeeding in a video game, sort of does involve learning and playing by certain rules. So while they're not tricky and you don't need a decoder ring to decipher their meaning, it's also important to keep in mind that a poem wouldn't mean anything if it could mean everything. Finally, poems are not fragile. When we worry about overreading or analyzing them to death, we should stop, right? You can't kill a poem. But a poem does experience a sort of living death if it's not read, reread, and pondered over. Poems need you, and I think you need poems. Not only can they bear the weight of your careful attention, but they also deserve it, because after all, the best of them are the result of someone else's most careful attention. I have included a list here in this presentation of an incomplete compilation of the key terms defined and explained in the chapter Poetry, Reading, Responding, Writing in the Norton. Note that this is definitely not a complete list. I kind of quickly went through the chapter and picked things out but it doesn't even include most of the key terms covered in this presentation, for example. So it's just the beginning, and you'll need to go through and sort of add to it and compile your more complete vocabulary list based on your needs on your own. It is important, however, that you do this. The ultimate goal of learning all of this background information and mastering vocabulary isn't to definitively pigeonhole every poem or drive ourselves crazy picking them apart, but rather to develop a language through which to recognize, describe, and explore different poetic modes. So knowing which mode dominates in a particular poem can help ensure that we privilege the right questions as we read and write about it. Learning the conventions of particular subgenres and kinds allows us to better adjust to individual poems, to compare them to each other, and to appreciate how each creatively uses and reworks generic conventions. In a nutshell, identify words that you don't know and build your vocabulary as we read through chapters related to poetry in the Norton. This is the end of the poetry reading, responding, writing presentation. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your life.